Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Fifth Child podcast, the weekly podcast where I, your podcaster Chris, give you two different recommendations, either for video games, movie, television series, entertainment, whatnot. So, happy Halloween, everybody. I'm hoping that I can get this episode released exactly on Halloween, which is on a Thursday, which again will be weird for the normal uploading schedule for the podcast because I always try to get them out on Friday. But as it happened, Halloween turned out to be on a Thursday this year. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm hoping that this episode comes out on Halloween. And I just want to say again, happy Halloween. Halloween is one of my personal favorite holidays. In fact, this these next 3 months are probably some of my favorite months. I love Halloween, I love Thanksgiving, and I love Christmas. And I think Halloween, out of all three of these, Halloween is definitely one of the ones one of the holidays that I have the most fondness for, particularly the whole month of October. For Midwestern Illinois, unfortunately, this October's been kind of a bit hazy. We kind of didn't really have that much of a fall, unfortunately. Almost for a couple bits there, we had more of an extended summer because we also had some tornado activity, so it kind of sucked that we didn't really have that much in October. But hopefully this next week or so should bring us that good fall weather that I like. So for this week's podcast, I was trying to think of something interesting that I wanted to do with it. And I was kind of conflicted as to what exactly I wanted to do. There are a lot of... I wanted to focus mostly on either horror movies, and maybe talk about horror movies that maybe not a lot of people have seen, that I love, that are some of my personal favorites. And unfortunately, I didn't really have... I couldn't really think of a good plan to really go off of. I had a specific idea throughout the month that I really wanted to do. I wanted to talk about my personal favorite horror movie, and I wanted to talk about my personal favorite horror video game. If you listen to the last week's podcast, I talked about my personal favorite anime horror series, and as I said, there's really not a lot of good horror anime out there, so unfortunately I couldn't give anime nearly as much love this season as I really wanted to. Hopefully that might change in the future. Maybe we can get better horror series out there. But for the horror genre and movies, there are a ton of movies that I've seen. I have really gotten to love horror series and anime. I really have gotten to love horror movies since my high school years. And I've also become more and more acutely aware that a lot of them are just really strong films. And there really are a lot that I could talk about, but honestly, I want to save the in-depth discussion for later, and actually talk about those movies at length in their own little section of the podcast. That way I can actually give them a good deep dive. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and just do a quick fire of some of my favorite personal horror movies that I have seen. And I'm actually going to try to avoid the big popular ones. I want to talk about the ones that I don't think very many people have seen. And then I'm going to go straight into the discussions of this week's podcast, which are my personal favorite horror movie and my personal favorite horror video game. So the first movie, so right now we're just going to do a quick, I don't want to take too long on this. I'm just probably about less than a minute on each episode, less than a minute on each movie. I'm just going to give a quick fire of my personal favorite horror movies that I have seen that I don't think many other people have seen. First up on the list is going to be The Babadook. So The Babadook actually is a movie that I think a lot of people have seen. It was a little low-budget Australian horror movie that came out in 2014, and it's since gotten actually a fair bit of popularity recently, which is kind of interesting because if you look at the IMDb score, it is extremely low. And I think that's mainly because there's audience expectations for The Babadook, that it's supposed to be this big, scary, awful monster movie. And it is. It does actually fulfill that quota pretty easily, but there's a good amount of hidden meaning within The Babadook. The hidden allegorical meaning of a mother and a son going deep into madness as the mother deals with grief at the losses and tragedies that she's dealt with in recent memory, and how that manifests in the form of a monster. And I don't think many people actually appreciate that allegorical meaning, and I really enjoyed it. and I think that it is one of the better directed movies, recent memory. It's one of the best directed horror movies that I've seen. The main actress the main actress playing the mother, Essie Davis, gives an Academy Award-winning performance, and I believe it's criminal that she was snubbed in the 2015 Oscars, and I just think it's a really good movie. Another great horror movie that I don't think very many people have seen, What We Do in the Shadows. What We Do in the Shadows is a film that is made by the same creative team behind the Flight of the Conchords television series and musical group in New Zealand, and it is a mockumentary about vampires, directed by Taika Waititi and also starring Taika Waititi, who would go on to direct one of the best MCU films, Thor Ragnarok, and also has a lot of the Flight of the Conchords regulars like Jermaine Clement, Rhys Darby, Johnny Brua, however you pronounce his name. And it's one of my personal favorite horror comedies of all time. It is fantastic, and I wish everyone could go see it. Another personal favorite movie of mine is Annihilation. Annihilation is a science fiction horror film that was released last year. That was also directed by the same guy, that was also directed by Alex Garland, the same guy behind Ex Machina, which I debate about saying it was a horror movie, but I don't think I'm going to call it a horror movie. It's more of a science fiction thriller than anything. And Annihilation was a science fiction horror about a group of scientists who go to this unexpectedly habited wildlife preservation, trying to look for one of their fellow scientists, played by Oscar Isaac, who had gone missing, who is also the husband of the main character, portrayed by Natalie Portman. And the film itself is incredibly deep. It has a lot of great meaning about evolution, extraterrestrial life, and our place in the universe, and it does raise a lot of existential questions about human existence that I really enjoyed. And I think it was really underrated back in 2018, especially because it barely got a limited release in theaters before it just got slapped onto Netflix. Another great movie to talk about that I wanted to mention is also the recently released 2018 horror film, Hereditary. Hereditary is probably my favorite film that I've only seen about twice, and that's because it's not the most enjoyable film to watch. Hereditary is a very miserable experience, in the best way possible. The film is excellent at making you feel uncomfortable. The main actress, Toni Collette, portrays a mother going deeper into a state of madness. And the film is a great allegorical tale about the tragedies of mental illness. There's also a lot of good. The film has a great interplay between allegory and literal meaning as well. And the film was a great directorial debut by Ari Aster, who also directed another horror film back in early 2019 called Midsommar, that I haven't watched yet, but I heard it's not as good as Hereditary. And then the last film I wanted to talk about, and again, this is one film that I wish I could spend the entire podcast talking about how much I love this movie, and that is The Witch. The Witch is probably my personal favorite horror movie in the last decade, and it's also because it's a horror movie that is disguised as a period drama film. Or some people could argue that this is a period drama film disguised as a horror movie. The film is a fantastic tale about a New England family that was excommunicated by the Catholic Church in Puritan times in the 1500s or 1600s, whenever that takes place. And the family just slowly descends into madness. Their crops get devastated, and it's suggested that they are, in fact, being bewitched by a witch in the woods. And the film is also a pretty interesting tale about female empowerment, as the main character, played by Anya Taylor-Joy, slowly becomes distrusted by the rest of her family, and it's just a fantastic movie. unfortunately, it also, I think, it's in the same ranks as The Witch and The Babadook. Get Out, not really Get Out. Get Out was actually pretty well liked by users. It's in the same kind of class that Hereditary, Annihilation, Us, and a few other films are. A few other, like, arty horror movies that get rave reviews in film festivals, and then they're released into the general public, and then the general public thinks that they suck because they're boring, they're not conventional horror films, and that's kind of upsetting, because honestly, I find these movies to be way more scary than other films out there. So that's kind of it for the quickfire recommendations. Again, I didn't want to spend too much on this because I would rather talk about some of these movies in their own podcast episodes. So I'm going to go ahead and actually switch gears. I'm not going to talk about my favorite movie quite yet. I'm going to talk about my personal favorite horror video game. And unsurprisingly, it is in the Resident Evil series of video games. And it is Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 was released in 2005 and was the newest Resident Evil game that was released after a good slew of spin-offs, and also remakes and ports to next-generation consoles such as the GameCube, the PlayStation 2, and the Xbox. Resident Evil was in a very interesting state back in 2004 and 2005, because the series was not in good financial standing. Around that time, there was the release of the Paul W.S. Anderson films, which did raise a little bit more awareness to the movies, to the video game series. But at the time, there wasn't actually a lot of well-received video games by the audience for Resident Evil. Before Resident Evil 4 came out, we had already had the mainline Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, and Code Veronica, which were all very well liked critically, but the audience reception had slowly began to dwindle. The series was not doing as well as it did at the beginning financially, and after Resident Evil 2, there was a good dip. 3 didn't do nearly as well. Code Veronica didn't do nearly as well, and surprisingly, and I want like the films I talked about earlier, I want to give the full Fifth Child podcast treatment to this game. There was also the Resident Evil remake that was only released for the GameCube back in 2002. And the Resident Evil remake is one of the best horror games of all time. For a 2002 GameCube game, the game is also a visual wonder. It is still one of the best looking games out there. Despite its realistic look, its use of atmospheric backgrounds and character animations still stand the test of time. And in all honesty, the GameCube version is still the best looking version of the game because the HD remastering actually creates some blemishes that aren't in that GameCube original. There are some things about high definition that actually brings out some of the ugliness and actually shows the datedness of it. So the GameCube version still stands as probably the best looking version of the game. And it altogether is a very faithful recreation of the original Resident Evil game while updating it into 2000 style sensibilities of horror games. Unfortunately, the game didn't do nearly as well financially. It did not earn nearly as much as Capcom, I think, wanted them to. And so that kind of caused some bit of reevaluation of what they wanted to do with Resident Evil. So in comes Resident Evil 4, or the long development of Resident Evil 4, where the series was mainly spearheaded by two of Capcom's best directors, Shinji Mikami, who directed the original Resident Evil 1 and would go on to direct 4, who would go on to direct the Resident Evil remake and Resident Evil 4, and would also direct other games like The Evil Within, and Hideki Kamiya, who directed Resident Evil 2 and would then go on to create the Devil May Cry series, and would also go on to direct more action-oriented series like Bayonetta. So Resident Evil 4 had a very interesting life in that it was originally conceived as a completely different game entirely. When the Resident Evil 4 was first being developed, there was actually an interesting period when the originally developed Resident Evil 4 then became Devil May Cry, and this is because that version of Resident Evil 4 was much more action-oriented. The Resident Evil series had always been a survival horror game to its roots, But because of the poor sales of the Resident Evil remake and a lot of the Resident Evil spin-offs, this required Capcom to kind of make some changes to the series, and they attempted to go into more of an action gameplay route. And one of these bore the fruits of the Devil May Cry series. There are betas for Resident Evil 4 that suggest that it was also more survival horror, and did introduce the over-the-shoulder camera style that we see in the final products. But the game would then go on some more changes, and then we ultimately get the Resident Evil 4 that we have received now. So, the actual game for Resident Evil, I'll go ahead and talk about the quick plot of it. So, the Resident Evil 4 plot is one of the goofiest plots that you've seen in a video game. The series takes place after the events of Resident Evil 2, which, if you've listened to my podcast earlier, I talked about the Resident Evil 2 remake, where you play as the Raccoon City Police Department officer, Leon S. Kennedy, and his interactions with the Umbrella Corporation. So, in the events of Resident Evil 4, Leon S. Kennedy is now a government agent who has been sent to this rural village in the middle of Spain in order to rescue Ashley Graham, the president's daughter. And while Leon is there, he runs into a cult of very evil, angry Spanish people known as the Los Illuminados, which means the enlightened ones in Spanish. I think I have to think about that. I took French. I didn't take Spanish, so I never actually thought about that. And if you're a Spanish-speaking, if you actually know your Spanish, there's some nice little Easter eggs throughout the game, because you can't actually, because a lot of the enemies in the game are these Spanish villagers, and they mostly entirely speak Spanish. So if you have a Spanish background, there's probably some neat little Easter eggs that you can listen to. If you can translate exactly what the Los Illuminados are saying. So we figure out that this cult had kidnapped Ashley, and we find out that these villagers were once just regular farmers in Spain, until they were infected by a parasite known as Las Plagas, which is kind of a different strand of the progenitor virus that we know in Resident Evil lore. So Leon decides to go throughout the entire village and fights against all the Spanish, fights against these evil Spanish parasite-infected people, before the plot deepens ever so slightly, and then, like every single Resident Evil game, we find out about a secret laboratory. There's an evil Spanish Napoleon-looking dude who decides to trap Leon inside his castle, and then we also find out even more that there's these experiments that have been done in order to create Las Plagas, and Leon must go face-to-face with the leader of the cult, Osmond Sadler, and how he plans to use the plague in order to propagate it throughout the entire world, while there is some tiny little trinkets of information that branches it over to the other Resident Evil games. As it stands, the plot of Resident Evil 4 stands on its own. You do not need to have played any other Resident Evil games in order to play this game, and in all honesty, it kind of makes a mockery of the games that came before it. It was at this point that Resident Evil 4 kind of completely discarded the completely serious horror angle that it had originally. The first Resident Evil game, the original Resident Evil game, had a little bit of a campy feel to it, and that was mostly because of the voice acting to it. The games did get more and more self-serious as it went on, leading its well into the Resident Evil remake, which is a deadly serious horror game that has a little bit of a campy feel to it. Very, very slight campy feel to it, but it still very much took itself seriously and was genuinely unnerving. Resident Evil 4 kind of throws all that out the window, and it kind of combined all the best aspects of the survival horror that the original, that the first four or so games had before it, while infusing a slight bit of camp to it. You can definitely tell throughout almost the entire runtime of Resident Evil 4 that it has its tongue firmly placed within its cheek ever so slightly, and it's perfect. This is one of the few games in the series that I wouldn't necessarily call it a horror comedy by any means. but it definitely has that action movie, B-movie camp that the other movies do not lack. I think if you go on YouTube and you were to say listen to reviewers such as Zero Punctuation state this, all the other Resident Evil games that came after this that had this action-oriented route, had the sincere dialogue, had the campy atmosphere, but they were missing the elements that Resident Evil 4 had, like squeaky voice midget Napoleon, Spanish Napoleon. So Resident Evil 4 was that perfect marriage, and throughout it all, it also still managed to be a genuinely unnerving horror game as well. The gameplay is a third-person perspective that uses similar tank controls that the other Resident Evil games have, but instead of the game being in a fixed camera angle, the game decides to showcase it from a third-person perspective. And if you have played any action video game after 2005, you know exactly what this kind of gameplay is. You see it in Gears of War, you see it in Uncharted, you see it in Tomb Raider, you see it in even recently God of War for the PlayStation 4. Resident Evil 4 laid down the groundwork of third-person action shooter to date. And it deserves all the credit that it gets for doing this. The game focuses more on this action-oriented state while still keeping in line with some of the survival horror aspects of the game. For example, there is an excellent weapon management system. In the game, Leon S. Kennedy has his own briefcase where he can keep all of his weapons, and you actually have to rotate and move around your equipment throughout your briefcase in order to fit the different weapons and such that you need to put in, that you need and that you use at that specific time. You can upgrade the size of it, you can make your briefcase bigger throughout the game, but you're kind of allotted to whatever space that you have in it. So you have to pick and choose exactly what weapons that you ideally would like to use the most, and if they can actually fit in the briefcase at that time, as well as fitting in your ammunition, your healing items, deciding when isn't the best time to combine your healing herbs together, when's the best time to actually use them. The game does have a lot of strategy to it that still is keeping well in line with the games that came before it, while also streamlining it ever so slightly and making the game much more accessible. While I love the original Resident Evil games that came before it, and while I also do love the Resident Evil remake, some of my problems are those quality of life enhancements that Resident Evil 4 put into the series at this point. I personally do not like now that I played Resident Evil 4 and have also played the Resident Evil 2 remake, it's hard for me to go back to the original over-the-head camera style that Resident Evil has, because, like I said before, you can't aim with your gun. You can't aim with your gun, and what Resident Evil 4 and, by extension, Resident Evil 2 done well is that they still managed to bring those modern sensibilities to the Resident Evil series while still keeping very much in line with what came before it. The game, just because it has those modern quality of life enhancements, it doesn't make it any less difficult than the games that came before it, or the games that it took inspiration from. They are still modestly difficult, and they still keep in line with the same sort of survival horror aspects that those games had. Excuse me. It just has some quality of life enhancements, such as, example, hey, maybe it actually is easier if you can aim a gun at someone rather than just putting your gun at the ready, pointing it in a specific direction and hoping you maybe get a headshot and hoping that you down the zombie. So Resident Evil 4 makes a lot of great changes that still resonate with the series to date. The music is fantastic. The music has a great has a great use of atmospheric tunes, while also having some interesting downtime and using silence sometimes to create tension. For a game released in 2005, the game still looks absolutely gorgeous. This is probably one of the first games in the PS2 GameCube era that can easily be considered next gen. This kind of game definitely seemed like it was a good jumping off point for when next generation graphics could be introduced, and I definitely give it all up to Resident Evil 4. So in terms of what the best version of Resident Evil 4 to play as, if you if you've been paying attention to it, you know that this game has been released multiple times. It was released for the GameCube, the PS2, Windows. It's on PlayStation 3, it's on PlayStation 4, it's on the Xbox One. It can be played on your phone in a light version. There's also on the Nintendo Switch, as is some other of the Resident Evil games as well. What's the best version of the game to play? Honestly, I think the best version of the game is the Nintendo Wii version. And that's mostly because of the Wii motion controls. I think the Wii motion controls are fantastic for the Resident Evil 4 port for the Wii, and I think it's kind of criminal that the Nintendo Switch version does not have these motion controls, doesn't have any gyro controls. Resident Evil Revelations 1 and 2 for the Nintendo Switch has the gyro controls that make the game even better to play, and I think it's almost peculiar that Resident Evil 4 for the Nintendo Switch does not have these gyro controls. So as it stands, the best version of the game is definitely the Wii version. I would think if you have a PC that can run Resident Evil 4, maybe the PC version would be the best. Most first-person games do work. Most shooter games do work better if you have a mouse. And I think having a mouse definitely does mitigate not having the motion controls for pointing. So if you want to play Resident Evil 4, I think the best versions to play would be easily the Windows version or the Wii version. So that's kind of it for Resident Evil 4. Again, this is probably my personal favorite horror game of all time. If it weren't for the fact that Resident Evil 2 Remake also exists too, in a perfect world, I wish I didn't talk about Resident Evil 2 originally, because I would honestly actually be talking about it right now, because I think Resident Evil 2 might be better than 4. I'm still not so sure about that. I just recently replayed Resident Evil 4 after I had already played through Resident Evil 2 about maybe 3 or so times by this point. So I think I need to sit on Resident Evil 2 Remake a little bit more before I decide if I like it more than 4. But as it stands, 4 had held the crown of being my personal favorite horror game to date, and I think it still is. I just need to think about it a little bit longer and think of whether or not Resident Evil 2 Remake has actually topped it. But for now, I think Resident Evil 4 still stands as my personal favorite horror game. So let's go ahead and switch gears into my personal favorite horror movie of all time. Now, this remains extremely unchanged. No matter what I say, this is still my personal favorite horror movie to date, and I consider this my favorite. I consider this one of my secret weapons, because it is a horror science fiction film. So I get to say, not only is this film my favorite horror film of all time, it's also one of my favorite science fiction films of all time, and it's one of my favorite films of all time, and that movie is 1979 Alien, directed by Ridley Scott and written by Dan O'Bannon. So Alien is one of my personal favorite films of all time. I love this movie to death. I think I've rewatched it multiple times, and I tried my best to rewatch it at least once every year, usually sometimes around Halloween or whenever I just really feel like watching it. This film is one of my personal favorite films ever. This movie scarred me when I first saw it as a kid, and then I grew to appreciate it more and more for its filmmaking power. So Alien was released back in 1979. Was released, I think, early May 1979, and is definitely one of the most influential horror films of all time, because in theory, on paper, if I could easily describe what Alien is, it's more or less a slasher in space. That is more or less exactly how I can define what Alien is that it is a horror movie slasher film that is mainly set in space, and yet it doesn't feel like it is. It is not filmed like it's a horror movie. It's not filmed, for the most part, like it's a slasher in space. So to go over the plot of exactly what Alien is mostly centered around the crew of a commercial space hauler known as the Nostromo, on its way back to Earth with a 7-member crew: Captain Dallas, Kane, Warrant Officer Ripley, the Navigator Lambert, their Science Officer Ash, and their engineers Parker and Brett. So the crew of the Nostromo ends up intercepting the space beacon on LV-427. No, not LV-427, LV-426. And they also work with a company known as the Weyland-Yutani Company, which has a company policy that if there is a distress signal, they must go there to find out exactly what happened. So after a little bit of bickering, they decide that they have to go to this exact distress beacon, and while they sustain some heavy damages, the main science officers, Ripley, and the science officers, the captain, decide to go out onto LV-426 in order to find out exactly what is there. And then they run into this ancient-looking ship with this huge alien that we have no idea what it is, that they have decided that until Prometheus came about, we decided to call it a space jockey. And then we also find out that the space jockey has been long dead, and it looked like another life form had come out from inside of it. And then the executive officer, Kane, runs into this huge chamber with a bunch of these weird-looking egg creatures. He decides to inspect one of these, and it opens up, and then this weird life form that we have no idea what it is decides to latch onto its face and burrow itself inside of his esophagus. Excuse me. And then they decide to bring him back, and then they do a little bit of research on this. They try to do some research while trying to find out how they can get this weird alien creature off of him. And as we're going throughout it, we get to see some interesting interplay, particularly with the science officer, Ash, who develops an interesting fascination with this life form. He develops a fascination with this life form at the expense of Kane, for the most part. Eventually they're able to get this thing off of him. The thing itself dies, and Kane seems to go about his normal everyday life with absolutely nothing wrong with him. And then the wonderful dinner sequence happens, and this is the moment in horror, and this is the one moment in a horror movie that I think probably scarred me the most when I first saw it when I was about 5 or so years old. Didn't mean to do it. I accidentally did it. I think it was just on AMC one day, and everyone's at the dinner table, and Executive Officer Kane, played by the wonderful British actor John Hurt, who has unfortunately passed away in the past 2 years. Rest in peace. He was one of my favorite British actors out there. There's literally no role he could not do. And one of the roles he especially is well known for is his fantastic death sequence. When a little tiny alien that was laid by this face-hugging alien that burrowed into his esophagus decides to burst out of his chest, and killing Kane, and then it scurries into the sewer systems into the ventilation ducts of the Nostromo, and then it evolves, it grows bigger in a very short amount of time, and decides to wreak havoc on the crew. And herein lies the slasher aspects of the film, where it's just a it's just a survival. It becomes a survival horror, where these ragtag group of space miners and space haulers are just trying to fend off an alien that they have no idea what it is, and it's out for blood, and it's out to kill them in incredibly gruesome ways. And it's fantastic. The film itself is a great use. The film has a great use of its setting to create a very claustrophobic environment throughout the entire film. We know that we're able to see that the Nostromo is incredibly big, and it's a big area. It's a big hunting ground for the alien that the title is named for. But the film itself uses a very claustrophobic setting where it's very isolated, and it's and one of the most well-known taglines of Alien is, "In space, no one can hear you scream." And that's one of the best aspects of Alien, is that it uses this isolated setting of this alien trying to pick off these space miners who are ill-equipped, who have no idea what they're up against. And it uses some incredibly good scares throughout the entire series, throughout the entire movie. One of the best moments in the movie is when the alien makes its first kill as a fully grown alien. And one of my favorite sequences is the sequence when one of the engineers, Brett, played by Harry Dean Stanton, excuse me, goes into is underneath one of the ventilation ducts, and the camera angle is situated in such a perfect way that you actually get to see the alien. You see the alien just kind of hovering above him, just dangling from the ventilation ducts, and it doesn't even do anything yet. You see the alien, you know it's there, and Ridley Scott, the director, knows that you know it's there, but it doesn't do anything. And that's terrifying. The terrifying aspect is, okay, it's there, when is it going to actually do something? That is easily one of the most tense sequences in the entire film. And it's like one of those moments, it's the kind of storytelling that is well known through Alfred Hitchcock, who's the director of Psycho, Vertigo, The Birds, North by Northwest. One of Alfred Hitchcock's favorite methods of storytelling is letting the audience know that there's a bomb under the table and it's going to detonate, but the characters don't know when it's going to detonate. And that creates a feeling of tension throughout the entire film, is that we see exactly where this alien is, what it's capable of, and we just don't know when it's going to strike, and it's perfect. Every performance in this movie is fantastic as well. Like I said before, I already named Executive Officer Kane. John Hurt, who is well known for having pretty gruesome thematic deaths, definitely has his crowning achievement right here with his great death scene when he's killed by the chest-bursting alien. Excuse me. The film also does a really good job at not letting you know who exactly the main character is. If you know what the Alien series knows, you know who the main character is. But throughout the entire movie of Alien, you don't exactly know who the main character is. The top billing of the film is Tom Skerritt, who is Captain Dallas of the Nostromo. And he does an excellent job in the film as well. He definitely does a great job exuding this leadership presence and being able to make the hard decisions that are necessary. And then the film makes a decision about 3/4 of the way through the film, where we lose Dallas as the main character, and becomes a bit of a surprise because he was the top billed actor in the film, and he was pitched as the main character throughout most of it, and then he's not in the film anymore. And then that's when the real main character of the movie comes out, Sigourney Weaver. So Sigourney Weaver as Ellen Ripley, the warrant officer of the Nostromo, is one of the best female main characters in film to date. And she really is given a chance to shine, especially in the last 20 or so minutes of the film, when pretty much her entire crew, spoiler alert, is mostly dead or captured by the alien. And she just has to work her way throughout the entire Nostromo and try to escape this one alien that's coming for her. There's no better way that a female character is given such empowerment throughout the movie, as is the last 10 minutes of the movie when it's that one-on-one confrontation between Ellen Ripley and the alien. And it's just fantastic, and it's one of the best climaxes in a horror movie to date, and it's definitely one of the most cheerful climaxes to date. And this film definitely gives Sigourney Weaver a lot of time to shine in the last 10 or so minutes. Not as much in the sequel Aliens, which I will talk about Aliens in a later time. Aliens is the direct sequel of Alien, that takes place many years after the events of the original Alien, that again features Ellen Ripley, played by Sigourney Weaver, as the main character. But the difference between Alien and Aliens is that while Alien is a science fiction horror film, Aliens is more or less a science fiction action thriller. And I think that's a little bit different of a distinction. I think both films do exactly what they do extremely well. Personally, I think Alien might be the better film. Aliens being paced as an action film means that there's a lot of slower moments that definitely get drawn out when the action's not happening. While Alien, yes, there are drawn out moments in Alien, but there's something to look for in those drawn out moments. Because it is paced like a horror movie, because it's paced as more of a horrific science fiction movie, there are those moments of downtime are where the tension gets wrapped up, and it works as a slow burn kind of movie. This is easily a movie that I could see a lot of mainstream audiences, especially back then and even maybe now, they could see this movie as being kind of boring. I think if Alien were released now, it could possibly join the ranks of The Witch, The Babadook, Hereditary, for being a film that doesn't exactly interest you nearly as much because you're not trying, because it's not doing its best to have something jump out and scare you. Yes, there are the moments when something jumps out and scares you in Alien, but they're kind of few and far between. What you instead get are these slow burning tension building sequences, where you get to see a lot of great establishing shots of either the practical sets of the Nostromo, the practical sets of LV-426, and the practical set of the titular alien itself, which, yes, it is a taller guy in a costume, and when you see the full body shots of it, it looks a lot less threatening because you can definitely tell it's just a guy in a rubber suit, which is one of the reasons why Ridley Scott does an amazing camera trick where instead of trying to show the full body nearly that much, he tries to shroud the alien in mostly shadow, and if there are any clear shots of the alien, it's mostly just close-ups of its face, and of its protruding tongue that it uses to impale people straight into the face and kill them. So that is one of the best... That's one of the best aspects of it, is the use of camera tricks to really make the alien a lot more threatening, a lot more lifelike, and try to detract from the fact that, yes, it is just a big guy in a rubber suit. So there's a lot of aspects of Alien that I love, and there's not a lot of stuff that I dislike. This is a film that I've seen multiple times. It's a film that I will always love, and I think it stands alone, and it's a film that does certainly stand alone by itself. You do not need to see Aliens right after watch it. You can watch it, and depending on what your tastes are, you probably could like Aliens more than Alien. As a film, I personally think that Alien is the better film. It's a much more tightly focused film than Aliens. Aliens is at least a solid half hour longer, and it definitely feels that half hour length. You can feel the length of Alien, but that's mostly because there are a lot of downtime moments that just aren't recognizably in other horror movies. Those slow moving scenes that build up the tension are important to Alien, and if you didn't have that, all you would have would just be climax after climax with none of the downtime to either recover or build up. So with that, I think that's it for me talking about Alien. I think this is my personal favorite horror movie of all time. I've seen it so many times to date, and I don't think it's going to be unseated anytime soon. I hope it does. I don't want to keep on saying that my favorite horror movie of all time was a movie from 1979. I want to see horror build itself more and more. And while there were a few films that I talked about in the preamble to this podcast that I think could have the potential of being better than Alien, I don't think Alien for me personally has been topped. So that's it for today's podcast. I want to say again, thank you so much for listening, and happy Halloween to everybody. So I have some ideas of how the next podcasts are going to go, and I'm going to drop this little hint. I don't know if you noticed, but there's going to be a Star Wars movie coming out in the next month and a half. I kind of want to talk about that, but I kind of also need to talk about the Star Wars that came before it. And I think it's important to get my own opinions out on Star Wars, just so you can kind of see where I'm coming from if you're an everyday listener. Star Wars is one of my personal favorite series of all time, and it's one that I've kind of fallen out of favor for, and it's no fault to the series itself, because I don't think the series itself is doing anything wrong creatively. I think it's important. I think it's kind of important to kind of get my standing on where Star Wars is as of right now, and my own opinions on it. So expect some conversations about the prequel trilogies, the original trilogy, and the Disney series. So I want to thank you so much for listening in. Again, happy Halloween. I hope you guys have a fantastic Halloween. I'm planning on dressing up for Halloween. I've got my own cosplays ready, so maybe next week's podcast, I'll go ahead and actually post some pictures of those within the podcast so you can kind of see what all I was doing on Halloween. So thank you so much for listening in, and I hope you guys have a wonderful Halloween.